Welcome to a show we're calling The World This Year. The World This Year, in partnership with the Daily Beast. Daily Beast foreign editor Nico Hines has crossed the channel to grace us with his presence. How are you, sir?
Very well, thank you.
Nice to see you. Nice to see as well independent journalist Ayşegül Sert. How are things?
Good.
Good.
Good. Very good.
All right. Very good. Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time Magazine. How's your Christmas period?
It's holidays. What's to complain about?
What's to complain about? Well, I'm sure that political consultant and commentator Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet will find something to complain about.
Yes, we are. I'm French, so being French, I've always got something to complain about. I wouldn't be truthful to my own country if I wouldn't.
All right. Throughout the year, you can listen, like, and subscribe to The World This Week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services.
Taken the decision to carry out a special military operation.
It was the year that war returned to Europe after the 2014 annexation of Crimea and Moscow's proxy war in the Donbass. Vladimir Putin justifying his invasion of Ukraine and appealing to its citizens.
Dear comrades, your fathers, grandfathers and great-grandfathers did not fight defending our motherland for today's neo-Nazis to seize power in Ukraine.
February the 24th. Vivian Walt, what was your reaction when you saw that speech?
I think everybody was a little stunned, although they ought not to have been. Certainly there were enough intelligence services, including the US, that was warning for months that Putin was going to invade. But even Ukraine was downplaying it. And what's so extraordinary is no matter where we were at the moment when the invasion happened, I don't think any of us really took into account how enormous this would be for the whole world and not just for Ukraine.
Yeah, a moment that caught the whole world off guard. Putin's Ukrainian counterpart, though, did not blink. Volodymyr Zelensky taking to Facebook, saying, we're all here. And on the night of February 24th, there he is with his inner cabinet. And when the United States allegedly offered to airlift him out of the capital, the Ukrainian embassy in London took to Twitter, quoting him as saying, I need ammunition, not a ride. That, too, was an early surprise of this war, Ayşegül Sert.
Yes, I was in Turkey a few days after the invasion of Ukraine, and even Turkey, that today shows itself as a big negotiator for peace, and did not see at what point this could be a key moment for the country to come back on the international scene. But the thing is in a way, I agree, we were surprised, but not really, because Putin, in those 2+ decades of reign, has always done what he has said he will do.
Yeah, but
and
hindsight is 2020. We're always...
Yeah, but remember Crimea, 2014. I mean, that was in the coming. He kept also saying to the U.S., not only U.S. intelligence, but saying, beware, I'm not very happy about NATO being that close to my border. So it was a surprise. It was a shock. It was a shock for him afterwards, too, because he never thought that it would last this long. But in a way, it was something in the coming.
Yeah, as you were saying, Ukraine outgunned, outnumbered. Quickly, though, Russia's plan went off script. Like on March the 10th, the world watched agape as a column of Russian tanks bearing down on Kyiv got stopped dead in its tracks in the northeastern suburb of Brovary, the northeastern suburb of the capital. The prediction you heard at the start in this very studio at the start of the war proving correct. First, Russia would win, then Russia would lose. Nico Hines, those images of those tanks getting stopped, everybody was shocked at that as well.
Honestly, seeing all these clips that we're looking at, it reminds you just what an incredibly historic year we're living through here. My heart actually jumped seeing Putin make that speech. I remember at the time that it cut to the core as you realised what was actually going to happen. And now the extraordinary events of the last 7 months, I think, when that war began, we thought it might be over in 3, 4, 5 days. And to see what's happened now is just extraordinary. Putin has bitten off much more than he can chew.
Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet?
Yeah, what we see is a personalized war. I mean, the first images of the war that we have is Putin declaring that he's in a state of war against Ukraine, and the first picture of Ukraine that we got is the leader of Ukraine stating that he wouldn't flee the country as expected. So it's like it was a personalized war from the beginning, and each leader is playing a very different game. And it's fascinating to see that we first expected that Putin, being Putin with all the display of strength and power, would win easily, and that the little Ukrainian guy on his Facebook page would lose. And it's actually the much more complicated situation.
Yeah, Zelensky holding that his phone to make.
Yeah, it's a symbol. That's why he got popular too. I mean, he's always wearing the same, battle shirt. He's always playing the Twitter, Facebook card. So he's very close to the people. Whereas Putin is displaying a lot of strength, power, is very far from the people, far from us. So it's like two different. It's like really a textbook thing of communication in a time of war. I mean, there will be books written about that.
Yeah,
sure.
Of course, there's also books going to be written about what happened on the battlefield, from that standoff at Snake Island at the very beginning, to the siege of the Azovstal steel factory in Mariupol, which went on for weeks and weeks and weeks, Vivian Waltz.
Yeah, and I don't think we have really seen anything quite of the scale. Perhaps Grozny is one comparison we can make. But really, this is kind of like Dresden or, Stalingrad, if you like. I mean, this is major.
But it could have been worse.
Warfare.
They could, it could have been worse in terms of people were expecting Ukraine to be flattened by carpet bombing.
Absolutely.
It didn't happen quite the way that it was predicted.
I think as near as we are sitting in Europe to Ukraine, I don't think that we quite get some essential things about Ukraine. And I remember interviewing people in Ukraine days before the war, and they said, Putin cannot invade. We've done the kind of calculations. We are hundreds of thousands of people under arms, and we're all prepared to drop our jobs and head to the front immediately. And I was kind of skeptical, and I think everybody was skeptical from this distance. But the nearer you were to it, I think the clearer it became that actually Ukraine was in it, and it was a fight for survival, and they were prepared to dig in. Of course, it would have been very different under a different Ukrainian leader, I think. You had a leader who could really rally the West. He just had this brilliant sense of communication, as Philippe says, and who was really prepared to just put it all on the line.
And we've seen the resolve of the Ukrainians as spelled out by Vivian there. France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent spoke with some of the few residents who, despite the shelling, had stayed in the Kharkiv neighborhood of Saltivka. That was in the spring. And then in November, when our crew returned, 75-year-old Ludmila was still in that apartment block and resolute after moving downstairs to the bomb shelter.
Зимою було 17 градусів, і я вижила. Так у мене ліжка тоді не було, а зараз я ліжко зробила отаке гарне. Ходімте, я вам покажу. А це теж банки у мене. Оце бачите? Я не боюсь тепер нічого.
I'm not afraid of anything now, that 75-year-old woman is saying.
Yes, and that shows really we were talking about what's the identity of the Ukrainians, and in a way, and it shows, I think what Putin is showing is how much he's been stuck in the past, and his thinking, I think, of invading Ukraine was like, we are brothers, we are of the same country. I'm actually not coming to invade you, I'm coming to liberate you. And
you think he really believed it?
I think that any leader who stays in power for more than 8, 10, 12 years, and he's been, 20 plus years, loses completely the being in touch with reality. So I think that he really believed what he said. But the Ukrainians of today are not the Ukrainians of the Soviet era, or not even the Ukrainians of, 10 years ago, in the sense of not only of resilience, but they were close to Europe, to the European I don't like that word, but values they were turning west rather than towards Russia. And Putin saw that and wanted to stop it. And we saw it with the few lines of this woman who's 75 saying, hey, I leave my house, I leave my town, what do I have left? I'll rather die.
When the war broke out in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin's interlocutor of choice, Angela Merkel, was recently retired. That left France's Emmanuel Macron, the one sitting at that long table, officially for social distancing reasons. This was in the days leading up to the invasion, as the president tried to take a stab at preventing war. But Putin's brutal invasion made any lingering ambivalence impossible. In June, Macron took the night train to Kyiv with Merkel's successor Olaf Scholz and the outgoing Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi. That had followed the French president's April re-election, one where he reminded voters that his opponent in the runoff, the far-right's Marine Le Pen, still owed the Russians money for the campaign loan on her previous bid for president in 2017.
This is bad news for our country because you depend on the Russian regime and you depend on Putin. You don't talk to other leaders, you talk to your banker when you talk about Russia. That's the problem, Mrs. Le Pen.
And that's one of the moments in that only debate that happened, where Macron scored the most points. People thought when the war began, oh yeah, but the election's in April. By that time, people won't be concerned about foreign policy anymore.
He's playing on a chord which is very, very delicate for the far right in France, because the far right in France has been influenced heavily by the Russian government for years. They poured a lot of money, but also a lot of TV exposure on Russia Today and media exposure and Sputnik. Whoever wanted to be on air could be on air. It was quite easy to be on Russia Today because they wanted to expand their influence. So the far right is divided between one side who is against Russia and really truly patriotic. They want to endorse the French side, no discussion about that. But there is a more ambiguous side inside the far right who is pro-Russian, actually, also anti-vaccination and also pro-fake news. And they would be the Trumpists. So we have a Trumpist side who is also pro-Russia and anti-vax. And that's on this that he plays. He is telling to Marine Le Pen, your side, it's divided in Russia, admit it. And you had some money because you also had some influence from Russia, poor than you.
Yeah, it's been a bad war for the likes of Nigel Farage, Donald Trump.
Yeah, certainly has. You're on the losing side, and you're ultimately probably going to be proven to be on the weaker side, which is what these people don't like. If you want to be a strong man, the last thing you want to do is getting beaten by a tiny, puny little country that's next door to you. And looking at that classic picture of Macron and Putin, two tiny little men on a big table, it brings to light how the reality, when these guys think that they're on these huge adventures, the reality can sometimes not be quite as grand as they dreamed.
When the war for Vladimir Putin also bringing two new countries into NATO, or so we hope, Aysegul Sert, because Finland and Sweden are not quite there yet. There are objections from Turkey's president, but it's all part of a kind of a bargaining process.
Well, Erdogan is a master. Is the third little man, as you would say, who is given too much power, and so whatever he has in his hands, he's trying to hold on to it. And so yes, he says, look, if you really want me to say yes to the fact that these two countries will be a part of it, give me back the Kurdish terrorists. Well, the word terrorist in Turkey these years have been overused for almost everything. So if you're an intellectual, not in the line of the president, you're probably a terrorist. So yes, he's using whatever he can, and for now it's NATO in order to play the international scene, and he needs that.
But it's worked to a degree. After all, he did broker with the United Nations that deal to export grain and fertilizer to the developing world.
Yes, but also do remember that in 2015, it did work the refugee card that he had in his hands that Angela Merkel really wanted to pass. And today we are actually coming back to it slowly, because Turkey is not, and Turkey through Bulgaria, etc. It's not using, and Serbia is not using really is not really living up to the work that it has done. So, always take what Erdogan says and does with a grain of salt.
Right.
That was too philosophical, but
Vivian Walt, the negotiations, the brokering that's been attempted, a lot of it's been done, in fact, by the United Nations, most notably because in the early days of the war, Russia seizing Europe's largest nuclear power plant, Zaporizhzhia, and the head of the UN's nuclear watchdog, able to broker a deal where at least there are monitors there.
This is kind of an extraordinary thing. I keep going back to what Nico said at the start of the show, which is we are living through an astonishingly historic year. There is such a kind of reordering of the world that is unfolding with the flashpoint being Ukraine, but really this is about a massive global shift that is happening. And you have the UN, on which Russia, of course, is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and yet it remains an essential body, which is kind of extraordinary, decades after its founding, full of holes, totally flawed, and yet it is perhaps the only body that could go in and negotiate something like some kind of deal around Zaporizhzhia, which is essential, obviously, for this region and the world.
Yeah, and we'll see, obviously, in 2023 how attempts to tone it down or to broker some kind of a deal will work. There's also another mystery when we're trying to pierce what's going on in Moscow, and that is why so many Russian businessmen have met untimely deaths in 2022. There's even a Wikipedia page. It counts 20 so far. The latest, as reported by the Daily Beast, is 50-year-old Dmitry Zelenov, who fell over a banister and hit his head in a friend's villa on the French Riviera in Antibes. Nico Heinz, these oligarchs, we saw them paraded out at the beginning of the war for a speech by Vladimir Putin. What's their standing today?
Well, hopefully they're not standing too close to the edge, I think, is the most important thing. It's such an important time for Putin in terms of his isolation. I think what we're seeing increasingly is there aren't as many people who want to stand up for him anymore. He's cancelled his recent big press conference. He's doing increasingly hard to believe press appearances. It used to be that they could, roll out the old classic photo shoot and the domestic media would get on board. And those old tricks are not working anymore. And more than ever before, he needs a close, tight-knit group of people around him to protect him, because I think he fears that he might be the next person that goes over the banister. And he's trying really, really hard to keep that group tight, to keep them under control, and to make sure that they're too scared to step out of line.
Are we making too much of these mysterious deaths?
I'm sure some of them are purely coincidental and misadventure. Absolutely. No, I don't think everyone is a murder, but I do think it's not coincidence, and that Putin is under a huge amount of pressure and is more desperate than he's ever been.
Let's turn the clock back again to February the 24th, because just before that, there was something of an Olympic truce that preceded the invasion. Vladimir Putin, who held his fire until after the Beijing Olympics, where he attended the opening ceremonies, held talks with China's president. But when it came time for Xi Jinping to make his first trip abroad since the outbreak of COVID in 2020, his first stop instead was oil and gas-rich Kazakhstan, a former Soviet republic that, like Ukraine, boasts a large Russian ethnic minority, and which has proven wary of Putin's Ukraine campaign. Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet.
Yes, what we see is that Putin is isolated also on the diplomatic scene. We expected him to have allies in China and India, and Modi, India's PM, has been quite clear about it, that he wouldn't support the war. He wants it to end. He stated that publicly, which is kind of huge. And China is very ambiguous, but obviously doesn't want to go to fall. I mean, that's the first time we cancel a whole country. It seems that the cancellation policy works for countries too. So that's unprecedented. We cut everything from Russia, the access to everything, credit, the internet, social media, goods. That's unprecedented. And this isolation policy that has been conducted with the help of the UN, it's apparently working, which is good.
Vivian Walt?
Look, I mean, the US...
I'm optimistic, right?
Yeah, I think
not
it's a
very
little bit optimistic. I think we have to remember that millions of Russians still support this war. Many, many, many millions. And they watch Russian TV all day long and completely buy the line that this is, a just military operation. But in terms of, the sanctions, I mean, one has to remember still that the US is still, for the meantime, the world's biggest economy, and that the sanctions powered by the US are massively impactful, particularly cutting off Russia's access to international financial transactions, etc. That is really where it hurts. And so if you're a Chinese business person or an Indian, trader of some commodity or other, you really can't afford to be, swept up in kind of indirect sanctions at a time like this.
Yeah, and like Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping was a man who took a big gamble in 2022. Yeah, the Chinese president seeing off supporters of predecessor Hu Jintao, who he publicly humiliated at a Communist Party Congress that lifted term limits for Xi. But his biggest challenge still comes from that invisible coronavirus. Images of mask-free fans enjoying the World Cup in Qatar contributing to last month's rare images of protests against the government. Cries of down with the party, down with Xi in cities like Shanghai. There were arrests, but calls seem to have been heeded since, and those lockdown rules have been eased. Is a bigger problem for Xi the fact that he's crossed this threshold by now lifting term limits, or this invisible coronavirus?
2022 is full of images like this, and I love it, of protests. You were talking about the fact that in Russia, there were not protests against the war. Well, they can't even say war, but the operation. But hey, kudos to the courage of so many people who in Russia at the beginning of the operation did go out in order, to show papers that there was, that protested. Same thing in China. I'm thinking of Iran too, but we'll come back to it. China, another country where there's not really, where the grand leader is actually supported and where silence reigns. Here is again these images of protests. It shows how, in a way, what you were saying about optimism, that maybe we are going towards a new year, a 2023, where the silenced can no longer be really silenced. Sorry for the repetition. And that protests like this will continue if leaders like Xi Jinping continue to just hold on to power even more and more.
And so now we have this easing of lockdown in China that's happened, and it seems as though the protests did play a part.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary, if you look at the timeline of it, Xi has been preparing for this 5-yearly Congress for, 5 years since he last had it. And he's been putting in place plans that he could make sure it's a smooth transition so that everyone can sign off and he's the president for life or in charge for as long as he wants to be. And yet he didn't seem to foresee this huge looming problem. He didn't have the excuse that the rest of the world leaders had, where nobody knew what this disease was, nobody knew how to combat it. Everyone knows exactly how to stop COVID now. And the answer is to vaccinate everybody, to get the best vaccines available and to deploy them, especially into the elderly. And he's had a 2-year period where he's been plotting, planning his legacy, coming up with harebrained schemes to get himself into the history books, and failed to do the most obvious thing in the world.
And there is this common thread. People might say the war in Ukraine. Aishigul talked about Iran, which we'll talk about more in next week's show, give it its fair due. In Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, when it comes to China, how COVID perhaps changed politics.
It changed politics because they went into isolation mode for several months, even years. and they have been locked. Its population has been locked down. The economic exchanges have been lowered, and they must have reconsidered what their position could be in that situation, and it must have been dangerous for them, even for Xi Jinping, to stay focused on the international policy, since he has too many domestic issues. I think we don't understand what it means. To be locked down for months at a time without the possibility to go to the supermarket, with police coming to your place, locking up the buildings. The food would be sent to you, and it was really harsh. And the problem that we face now is that this will become the laboratory for the replication of the virus. There will be millions of deaths or severely injured people. And what we will see is maybe a world shortage of medication in certain departments, because let's face it, that's the biggest population in the world. They will need medication, and the market is limited. And if you focus on France, let me just add that in France buys the products, the medication, at a very low price, because we have a state-subsidized sanitary system, so it wants to buy cheap. And countries like ours, who buy cheap on the market, they will be served last. So it will have huge repercussions.
Yeah, it's a reminder as well that for all this talk that we're going to shorten supply chains, and we've been having this discussion for 3 years now, how we're over-dependent. Well, China's still the world's factory.
It is. I mean, in some ways, I feel like Nico and I are the pessimists here, and we're facing the two optimists. But, I do feel like, obviously, China's economy is markedly weaker because of the COVID lockdowns. And, of course, it's had a global depressive impact. But it is and will soon be, perhaps, the world's biggest economy, overtaking the US at some point. And it is still a massive center of manufacturing, but even that has changed. I mean, many companies have begun to relocate under the COVID lockdown. And I think, honestly, more than, the protests, this really was the kind of alarm bell for Xi, who is an authoritarian leader. He can crack down on protests any moment he feels like it. But I think the fact that you had major companies pulling out of China, you had people who didn't want to locate their foreign business people there, you had a whole ripple effect.
That's going to be lasting.
That will be lasting. That will be lasting.
I would have never thought I would be optimistic for Xi Jinping. But on his behalf, I'd like to say that, yes, in a way, that there are things that are restraining for him. But also, don't forget, recently he was in Central Asia. I looked it up. In 2013, a few months after he came to power, he actually went to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, all these Central Asian countries. So he knows. I mean, these autocrats, dictators are political animals, but they're also survivors. So when they see someone like Xi Jinping, when he sees that the West is turning its back to it, he's turning towards Central Asia, Russia, Iran. And let's also not forget that I think China will remain on the map in terms of debates and economics, because the U.S. has an eye on it. The number one enemy of the U.S. in 2013, but just like it was in 2020 and in the Trump years, it was China, and we are coming back to it. So whoever you put your energy on grows in power. So China is not history yet. Xi Jinping is not history yet.
Right. Well, to you, she was your queen. To us, she was the queen, were the words of France's president as tributes to the world's longest-serving head of state, reflected a feeling that went well beyond the UK or the Commonwealth. In 2022, Queen Elizabeth passing away, her platinum jubilee earlier in the year, marking 70 years on the throne, already felt Nico Hines, like a farewell. It was quite an amazing moment when you think back to that Jubilee, because it's as if Britain had a chance to say goodbye to her already.
And there was a big kind of debate at the time, or people keeping their fingers crossed that she actually would survive until the Jubilee. So I think that was kind of baked into the whole thing. That was well known. People were waiting to give that final farewell to her while she was still alive. And I think it's all worked out very calmly. And I think just as she would have liked, everything went according to plan. I think what's become really obvious is just how phenomenally important she was and how brilliant she was at the job. She took over in 1952.
So more than a figurehead.
Absolutely. Britain doesn't have a written constitution. Technically, she can dissolve the parliament, and the monarch can dissolve the parliament. It's not clear what the House of Lords has power to stop the House of Commons from doing. It's all such a big jumble. And the only way it's worked is because you've had this phenomenal figure who is unimpeachably popular in Britain. Everybody likes the Queen. It doesn't matter, even if you hate the monarchy and think it should be brought down, you still like the Queen. And so she has managed to keep all these plates spinning in this kind of bizarre modern world. It's let's face it, it's a hangover from centuries bygone, and yet it's still there. But now that we've got this new guy in charge, he just doesn't have the skill, and already it's starting to unravel.
Doesn't have the skill. Yeah, the Queen Elizabeth, who was thrust into the job, the abdication of her uncle, the premature death of her father, suddenly put Elizabeth in the spotlight for now King Charles. The wait was so long that times have, as Nico says, certainly changed. Subjects who request and obtain a not so regal kiss on the cheek are a novelty. But even if Charles is a very familiar face, hot mics will still enable the world to get reacquainted with him.
You sound 12:30.
Oh, God, I hate this.
Oh, look, it's going everywhere. Hang on. So nobody got
Nico Hines, it's early days for Charles. This kind of incidents, do they matter?
Yes, that's the first impression that counts, and the Queen wouldn't even have thought of expressing an emotion such as this one, complaining about a pen. And you need to have a neutral face, you need to have a stiff upper lip, and obviously he's not built of that wood.
So it sounds like you're saying that the monarchy's in danger?
No, the monarchy is not in danger. Eventually will die and pass on to the next one. And maybe the next one will be better. That's the beauty of monarchy.
Okay. The monarchy may not be in danger, but there are problems with the constitutional democracy. Winston Churchill was prime minister when Elizabeth's reign began. She died on Liz Truss's second day on the job. The Conservative had hoped to follow in Margaret Thatcher's footsteps with tax cuts that instead spooked the markets and sent the pound tumbling. And when she tried to save her job by sacking her finance minister, Kwasi Kwarteng, well, the writing was already on the wall.
And her supposed best friend, the former Chancellor, he's gone as well. They're all gone. So why is she still here?
Mr. Speaker, I am a fighter and not a quitter.
And the rest is, as they say, history.
Yes. She might have been a fighter, but she had no choice in the end. She was effectively pushed out, and I think luckily for the country. But, I think it was a moment in which you saw the value of the monarchy, that there was a kind of sense that the wheels weren't completely going to come off this country because there still was this other institution that was kind of holding things sort of steady. The question I have is, whether or not the Conservative Party can continue their incredible long run as government after.
Well, there might be a snap election, is what you're saying.
I leave that to Nico probably to answer that, but I would say it seems unlikely, and I think that unlikely that they could continue for many years more. And I think all through Liz Truss's debacle of tenure, you had the opposition leader, Keir Starmer, looking wonderful, looking like the statesman that the country needed. And at least from the rest of the world's vantage point, that's what it looked like.
So you have this regal handover on the one hand at Buckingham Palace and this meltdown in the House of Commons.
Well, I think the Queen said, look, I've reigned for 7 decades. I've seen, the UK in the EU, and no longer. I do not wish to see Liz Truss, on government for the 3rd day. And that was at 96, goodbye. But joking aside, she has been an incredible, she had a grand life. I mean, she saw decolonization of the countries. She saw, scandals too, in a way. I'm thinking of Diana, but also of Meghan and Harry. She had several dogs. I mean, I think she had a grand life. And that's how she speaking of the cliche of witnessing history, she was a grand dame witness of history.
And now a new king and a new prime minister.
Yeah, it all came around
Rishi Sunak.
So quickly. I think one thing that Liz Truss seems to have got away with is any blame for the monarch's demise. I do think if she was on the verge of death and she was forced to get out of bed, go and perform all these official duties, take the photos, shake hands, she hadn't basically she'd been avoiding doing these kind of on-camera duties for months and months because of her ill health. So I do think there are some questions to be asked about whether it was wise that she got out of bed.
That's not Liz Truss's fault, though.
Well, perhaps it was not her fault, but I think somebody might have made a more sensible decision and allowed her to do that one over Zoom. Rishi Sunak has now taken over, and it's quite funny because his very obvious policy is don't be on TV, don't say anything, don't be seen. I'm not sure it's a very good idea because he would have been, by comparison with Liz Truss, everyone would have gone, oh, hey, this guy looks like he knows what he's doing. I understand that he realises the Conservative Party aren't very popular at the moment, so perhaps he should keep his head down. But I think he's missed his opportunity to use that kind of honeymoon period to imprint an image of himself as a strong, stable leader.
It was the year we said goodbye to a queen. And it concluded with another coronation, that of a king of the world. 7-time Ballon d'Or winner Lionel Messi leading Argentina to its 3rd World Cup title, the first since the passing of the legendary Diego Maradona. The Albiceleste beating Les Bleus in a thrilling final that went all the way to a penalty shootout and also lifted the spirits of a nation otherwise in the throes of deep political and economic turmoil. When you look at the state of today's Argentina, Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, kind of have the feeling they needed this more than we did.
Yes, sure. That's you can always tell that to yourself. I mean, it's comforting thought, right?
I'm trying.
Yeah, you should. And, but there was, once, when I was a publisher, I published a book once, which title was Dolor País. It's difficult to translate in English, but it will be I don't know. It's this feeling that there would be a pain that would be shared by all Argentinians, and that it would be a national pain, if you want, and that's been on the Argentina's shoulders for years. I mean, ever since the economic structure restructurations of the 80s, 90s, the country has been going from bankruptcy to bankruptcy. I mean, it's always the same scheme repeating, and they needed that because also South America is really the land of football, even more than Europe and even more than the US, obviously. And it's a symbol of, this fight between France and Argentina. It was really also symbolic of the time we are in. I mean, of this divide between the rich and the poor. I mean, on the social level, it was interesting. Also, and it's fair that Argentina did win because, in a way, it's a symbol we all needed.
It's only a game, or is it? Because the way Philippe is describing it, these national football teams are the embodiment of a nation that bring together an otherwise divided people.
Well, First of all, I need to say that I think Dolor País would have been something like Don't Cry for Me, Argentina.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. It was written by a psychoanalyst as his specialist.
And performed wonderfully by Madonna. But to come back to this game, look, Macron made this game political. If there's one guy who has made it, I mean, I must say, my country's president, Erdogan, was actually one of those guys who went to Qatar, but his reason was not for the game. It was not in order to boost his ego. It was in order to have the sign checks by Qatar, because Turkey really needs it. The omnipresence of French President Macron and the absence of the Argentinian president because of the economic situation made it that this game is not just a game. It's not only about the people, it's about the countries.
Vivian Walt?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I wrote a piece about this yesterday and found the Argentine president's statement on Saturday saying, I will be watching the game from home, celebrating with my people like I always like to do. I mean, the contrast was so stark, really. At the medal ceremony, you had Emmanuel Macron on the medal line, and the president of the winning country was not there.
In fairness, that's happened at a lot of World Cups.
That's true.
But Emmanuel Macron was everywhere. He was in the locker room. He was on the ground. He was on the at his seat. I mean, you saw almost Macron as much as you've seen Mbappe.
But there's so many layers to this. The one being, of course, the very close financial relationship between France and Qatar. And the fact that Qatar owns Paris Saint-Germain, and that both Messi and Kylian Mbappe play for Paris Saint-Germain, effectively work for the Qatar government.
Yeah, Kylian Mbappe, who already at the age of 19 had tasted the joy of a World Cup trophy back in 2018 in Russia. For the 35-year-old Messi, it's a dream come true in his fifth and probably last stab at it. Nico Hines, we've spent the better part of a month berating corruption, political interests at FIFA. In the end, they got their dream final.
Absolutely. If they had just, I mean, it seems that Messi and Mbappe don't even want to play for PSG anymore. They don't want to play. They don't want to be owned by Qatar anymore. But it was very obvious that the deal was you stay owned by Qatar until this World Cup, because we want to have our two big guys that we've spent hundreds of millions of pounds on, demonstrating our wealth and our power on the global stage. And they couldn't have dreamt of a better final. I mean, to have both of them scoring multiple times, it was a head-to-head Mbappe versus Messi game, which never happens in World Cups. It's always, you think it's going to be this superstar, and then it turns out to be the left back who gets a header in the 91st minute. On this occasion, it really was the dream scenario. And we look at rich countries in Europe, poor countries in South America, and ultimately they're all owned by the same regime in the Middle East.
May I just add something? Because we can't close this without talking about Morocco. I mean, when you say about the poor, and Morocco was not only the shocked surprise, but we almost felt, Philippe, you were talking about, this attachment to the country. We all felt Moroccan. It was incredible to see this country come out of, in a way, nowhere, represent the Arab countries, but also,
Also Africa, first African team in the semifinal.
Exactly. So it was, I must say, this, for me, it was the most precious moment to see Morocco come this far.
All right.
But their star player, Hakimi, owned by Qatar, plays for PSG.
Plays for Paris Saint-Germain.
Such a pessimist. It's true.
We'll be back next week, by the way, for a look ahead. Everybody's brought their crystal ball, and we'll be looking at the year that will be 2023. I want to thank Philippe Moreau-Chevrolet, Aisha Goulsert, Nico Hines, Vivian Walt. Thanks for being with us. More news on France24.com.